Hello and welcome to today's screencast. Focuses on routes to sport and excellence in the UK. So ultimately, the first thing we're going to have a look at is as follows. We're going to look at the development routes from talent identification through to elite performance. What that basically means is if you are taking part in a sport, you would start at the very bottom of the sports development pyramid here. You would take part in that sport. Ultimately, if you are good at that sport when you start participating, you might be identified as talented. Now, once you're identified as talented, you will take certain steps to move up through to elite sporting performance. We're going to look at those talent identification stages that happen when you move through. Let's imagine you're a talented cyclist, a talented rower. We're going to have a look at specifically two key bodies that when you make this move from participation up to elite sporting performance, that will support your performance. So we're going to have a look at UKSport and the National Institutes of Sport. Both of these work only with elite sporting performance, those people who are about to go to the Olympics or take part in world championships. So we'll look at specifically the roles of those two. Now, on top of that, we're going to have a look at the roles that schools, clubs and universities play in contributing to elite sporting performance. So we'll have a look particularly at how schools help at this participation stage, clubs help moving from participation up to the elite stage, and we'll have a look at universities and the massive role they play in pushing elite sporting performance. Final thing we're going to have a look at are a lot of people make those stepping stones up to elite sporting performance, but the problems being that sometimes people drop out. So we're going to have a look at the strategies that can be used to address dropout and failure rates at elite level sport. So let's start off. Let's look at the first objective then, talent identification. Okay, so what are those development routes? So the first thing we're going to have a look at is under the umbrella of UKSport. Now we're going to look at UKSport in more detail later in the screencast, but for now, a little overview. It is the ultimate organisation responsible for providing or identifying talent, I suppose, but then the big role of UKSport is funding that talent and allowing them to perform at an elite world-class level. To do that, they have one key role that we're going to look at early in the screencast, and it refers to something called the World Class Programme. Now, the World Class Programme is specifically linked to athletes who have a potential of winning medals in either the upcoming Olympics or the next but one Olympics. So ultimately, the World Class Programme would involve both supporting the athlete via training, but it can also involve the funding, particularly funding. And the funding will be based on how close the athlete is to performing at an Olympic Games. So what I'm going to do is give you the two key components of the World Class Programme. One is podium. Now, podium is the one where you get the most support and the most funding. And this would refer to supported athletes with a realistic medal winning capability at the next Olympics. And the maximum it can be is 4 years away from the Olympics. So that is where the top funding and support stream within the World Class Programme is called podium. The next one down is something called podium potential. Now, podium potential refers to very similar supporting athletes with a realistic medal winning capabilities. But this time it'll be the next but one Olympics, and we're looking at a maximum of 8 years. So that's what we're looking at there. So 8 years, maybe 2 Olympics away in terms of funding and support. So as you can imagine, podium will maybe have more support. Podium potential would have slightly less support and less funding, but as it moves up, they will then slowly move into podium after they've done their first 2 to 4 years on podium potential. So hopefully that's pretty straightforward. Now, just to give you a little bit of a look into here, how that might look in an exam question, you might pause it now, have a look at that, see if you can have a go at naming those two, have a little description, maybe the basic description's the same, it's just dependent on how close they are to the Olympics in terms of how you differentiate between the two parts of the World Class Programme. Next thing we're going to have a look at them, we're going to have a look at this process of development routes and the talent identification process. So ultimately, we have to go through 4 stages of talent identification. So UKSport proposes, when they're organising talent identification, phase 1 is consisting of physical and skill-based tests. And this will depend on the sport. For example, if it was track athletics, there'll be lots of sprinting-based things. If you were a field, maybe looking at some kind of jumping activity, do jumping tests, just to see the suitability for people in that area. Once that has happened, and you've had the physical and skill-based tests, and you're considered talented, then you would move on to phase 2 and 3. Now, phase 2 and 3 is moving on to this idea of screening. So particularly, they'll be looking at physical and medical screening okay, as your first thing. And then on top of that, there'll be lots of psychological assessments to see whether people have that kind of psychological mindset, that grit required to perform at the very elite level. Okay, once these are passed and people feel like, okay, physically, medically, they're in a good position to move on to elite level sport. Psychologically, they're in the position to move on to elite level sport. You'll then move on to phase 4. Now, phase 4 is often known as the confirmation phase. So within the confirmation phase, selected athletes who move into a national governing body, a talent identification scheme, for example, British cycling, British rowing, they will then get a period of training over 6 to 12 months. And within that 6 to 12 months, there'll be continuous assessments and checkpoints to see if they are still suitable to take part in that. So, for example, if you're in British cycling, for example, the national governing body of British cycling, they will do lots of assessments, there'll be lots of kind of races, and they will see if that performer is still at the level, are they still hitting the times that would allow them to move into Olympics or World Championship performance. Now, once this has happened, some people will not be successful. And if they're not successful, they're given the opportunity to go back in to club performance, and that just allows them to get away from the kind of the UKSport talent identification process, and they'll go into club cycling events and just have a go to see if they can get their performance back up. So final thing to look at is to have something called a pathway health check. Now, the pathway health check is just basically every 4 years a check on performance and fitness levels, which coaches will discuss whether the performer is still on the right road to go into maybe one of the world-class program funding streams, or whether they need to maybe be removed from the program. Now, I'm going to put down the bottom here. The title of this is Development Routes and Talent Identification through to Elite Performance. I'm just going to put onto here now some examples of talent identification programs that have been used. So you have, these are things that have done. Tall and Talented, particular focus towards rowing. These were national campaigns where people, kind of the UKSport scouts would go around to different schools and look at different people, look at their height, screen them, maybe look at their suitability for things like rowing. You could have Discover Your Power, was linked to cyclists. Okay, so people will go on, or rowers, so they'll go on to the ergo or cycling machines, and they will have a look at them and see, right, have they got the power that will be required to perform in that? And a big one recently is Girls for Gold, looking at talented female athletes and looking at their suitability to perform at elite level. So these three are really, really useful when thinking about these talent identification processes. So if we move on from there then, I've had a look at what you go through. So UKSport will identify talent. Okay, one of their key roles is identifying talent. This is the process of talent identification through to elite performance. Now, what we have to look at now specifically then is UKSport on its own. So if I said to you on here, before we do that, if you want to have a quick look and pause, you can have a look at a potential exam question on here, what that would look like. So see if you can fill in any of those. I will move on to my next slide now. So going in from here then, UKSport then. UKSport is the key organisational body that develops elite sports performers in the UK. It is not bothered with participation. All it is really focused on is that very, very top level of sport. And it's looking at the following key roles. First one, it works with elite coaches. Okay, and the idea is that if you're identifying talent and you get elite performers, they want to provide the very best elite coaches to help work with elite athletes. And if we do that, you've got more chance of world-class performance at elite sporting events. Next role for UKSport is the key one. It distributes national lottery funding. Okay, and it does this in two ways. Now, basically, if you imagine you buy a lottery ticket, that lottery ticket across the country gets put into different pots. One of them is elite sporting performance and UKSport. So UKSport will get all this money coming in from lottery tickets, okay, and then they will distribute that via the world-class program that we talked about before. So that, for example, they might have athletes on, they might put certain athletes who are really close, that 2 to 4 years away from Olympic Games, put them on podium performance. So that will give the podium scheme, which would mean they get the highest amount of funding going forward. So that is one example there. Also, there is another thing that is directly linked to this. It's called the Athlete Performance Award. And this is how individual athletes are funded. Okay, so they will get £65,000 a year if they are on the very top level of funding, if they have a big chance of winning a gold medal. On from there, we have funding for national institutes. So, for example, if you are we'll look at this next. If you are identified as talented, you will be given an opportunity to have practical support at the national institutes. UKSport takes the money in from the government and National Lottery and funds these national institutes. So they will make sure the very best sports science facilities are available at things such as the English Institute of Sport in Sheffield, another English Institute of Sport at Loughborough University. So these are examples, and we'll look at those a little bit more as we go through to the next slide. On top of that, another role of UK Sport is we have it's another role is it attracts international events. So if, for example, there is a World Championship or an Olympics, UK Sport are involved in the bidding process to try and make sure that we secured London 2012, for example. So one of their roles is attracting these big events for elite sporting performance to flourish. Finally, it funds, as we looked at on the previous slide, talent identification. For example, I'll put two things in there: talent identification funding streams such as World Class Programme, and also things such as Girls for Gold and any of the other talent identification schemes that I put on the previous slide. Now, moving into here then, UK Sport, big organisational body. It selects the elite athletes who are going to perform in Olympic Games squads. It funds the national governing bodies for the World Class Programme, the Athlete Performance Award. Ultimately, if you imagine it, it's the money. Okay, it's where all that money is distributed and allocated to different sports depending on their chances of winning medals. Now, once they have been selected, they will then given the opportunity to go and train at something called the National Institutes of Sport. So before I look onto that, you might just have a look at this key way of remembering the roles of UK Sport. So I put ELITE in here as an acronym. So you've got ELITE and you've got a double I. We don't use the E at the end, but each of those will go directly link into one of the bits in red there. So I'll go through that in lesson, but just so you can see that in action. So if we go into the National Institutes of Sport, you are successful, you've been identified as talented, you move into a national governing body squad, e.g. British cycling, e.g. British rowing. Once you're in those squads, you then get the opportunity to use the National Institutes of Sport. Now, these are a nationwide network of expertise and facilities, and they are considered the team behind the team. Now, I put an example here as the English Institute of Sport in Sheffield. There is also an English Institute of Sport at Loughborough University. There's also one at Bath University. And these are all this nationwide network of different institutes which can support elite athletes. So their specific roles then are as follows. They will provide world-class facilities. And when we talk about this, it's so important we don't just talk about the place. So we can't just say English Institute of Sport Sheffield. We can't just say Loughborough University. We've got to say the Loughborough University Olympic swimming pool. So that is the key thing we're looking at there. So that is the world-class facility, not the world-class university, the site. Also, you could have Bath University as an Olympic 50-metre swimming pool. On top of that, National Institutes of Sport will provide talent identification. So they don't fund it, but they are responsible of the actual taking the talent identified or the identified talent and putting it into training programs. For example, they will actually go around and have a look at this Girls for Gold, or they will work with people who've been identified as talented girls who are potentially going to get gold medals. On top of that, they will also be responsible for education and research. And very similar to what we looked at in biomechanics when we looked at things such as wind tunnels. So looking at this idea of how by putting certain things into wind tunnels, you can look at aerodynamic performance. So for example, we're looking at the design of cycling helmets, looking at the design of bikes, and we look at specifically how we can make those more aerodynamic. So it's really, really important that we consider these National Institutes of Sport as being responsible for education and research. That is your example. On top of that, they provide medical support. So if you're an elite athlete on one of these talent identification programs, you will have access to the very top physiotherapy. So you could go to EIS Sheffield, for example, and get your physiotherapy looked after, and it will be fully funded. Finally, and the thing that we'd be interested in, I suppose, as A-level PE students potentially going into careers, we're looking at sports science support. So you get access to things such as biomechanists that will have a look at your kind of movement patterns and might look at force plates and have a look specifically at your technique and how we can improve it. And also things such as sports psychologists who will have a look at confidence strategies, for example, how you manage anxiety in elite sporting performance. So they are our key things there. So we'll have a look at how we can remember that in lesson. But a final thing we're going to have a look at is the role of school, clubs and universities in contributing to elite sporting success. Schools and colleges then have three key roles to play. So we have the following. So I'm just going to ask you to make notes on this one. Very similar to what we looked at in Year 1 Sociocultural Studies and Education in the 21st century. Clubs have other roles. So they will provide competitive facilities. They will also provide that first stage of talent identification and provide specialist coaching. And finally, we have universities. Now, universities are massive at elite level because they provide sports scholarships. They provide specialist world-class facilities. They provide specialist world-class coaches, and they host national institutes of sport, such as Loughborough University being the host of a National Institute of Sport.